Hello there guys. In this video I'm going to be starting my build of this Miniart B-Type Military Omnibus in 1/35th scale. Now Miniart have released this kit in a number of different guises, including two separate civilian versions. They've also reused the chassis for a military lorry, for a civilian lorry, and recently for this really interesting looking armoured lorry. So you certainly can't say that Miniart don't get the most out of their moulds. Now for a long time I was quite interested in this civilian version. I wanted to build it up and then have it maybe in a workshop diorama where it was being converted to a military version, with parts being removed, with the windows being boarded up, and with it being painted in a khaki or an olive drab. But then I looked at some of the archive photos of these buses in use, both as troop transports and as ambulance buses, and I realised that was actually what I wanted to do. So I went for this military version. In reality there's not a huge amount of difference between the two kits, the decals being the most obvious one. As a side note, when I was looking through my archive photos, I saw several of these buses being converted into pigeon lofts for use on the front line for messenger pigeons, so perhaps that's something I could revisit in the future at some point. It would need a bit of scratch building, but I think now I'm more familiar with this kit, perhaps not as much as I might have initially thought. So looking at the box, we have this lovely artwork on the front here, painted in a sort of olive drab colour, covered in quite a lot of mud in the middle of some World War I battlefield. We've got a damaged town or city in the background and lots of damaged trees and so on. Very atmospheric environment there. Looking on the side of the box, there's nothing on the first long side. On the second long side we have a variety of different marking options here. We'll look at those in more detail later on, but it's not just different decals we have, there are slight changes to each vehicle. So it's our typical Miniart instructions with the full colour cover and painting guides. Our first paint option here is Second Company, Army Service Corps, Brighton 1914, with that quite distinctive Comrades marking there on the upper deck. And you'll notice on this version the windows are glass. On the second option you can see here we have an unidentified unit of the Royal Naval Division, autumn 1914. One difference you'll note here is the windows. They're not actually boarded up, they've just been painted over. Minimal decals on this one, just the RND on the sides and the front. The remaining paint schemes are at the back of the instructions. Option 3 is this one, 91 Company, Army Service Corps, Ypres, Spring 1915. And in this case you can see that the windows have been completely boarded up. My understanding is that as troops were loading into these buses with their weapons, it was very easy for them to break the quite fragile windows, and therefore sooner rather than later the army ended up basically just boarding over the windows. Option 4, 93 Company, Army Service Corps, Somme, autumn 1916, and used as an ambulance. This version has the painted windows, and then finally option 5, boarded up windows for the 90 Company, Army Service Corps, Cassel, summer 1917. So a couple of different options there. To be honest, I tend to play quite fast and loose with the options in situations like this. So I'll probably go with a set of decals that I like, and I'll do the windows however I think is best. To a certain extent it seems silly to board them up and you don't see the interior detail. Same with painting really. I might board up a couple of them and leave some of them glass. I haven't decided yet, to be honest. Moving on to the instructions proper, and it's a standard Miniart instruction booklet with these CAD style drawings. There tends to be quite a lot going on in Miniart instructions, and that's really because their kits have quite a high part count. So you can see here, even in step 1, just to make that sort of that basic engine block, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 parts just in that first step there. You can't fault Miniart on detail, that's for sure. And very quickly we also get there into the PE parts. You can see a couple of parts added in step 3 and step 4. Not kits for beginners, but they do give you a lot of detail. And so, for example, if you wanted to pose this with the engine exposed, you'd be able to do that with no problem, which is not always the case with kits from other manufacturers. Once the engine is built up, we build up the chassis. Again, lots of underside detail, lots of very delicate parts. Continue building up the chassis and the suspension. So that's the first sort of 30 steps. And then we move on to building up the upper part of the bus. So the instructions will have us putting the glass into the side panels of the passenger compartments before we put them together. Of course, if you're an experienced modeler, you'll know that's probably not a good idea because they all need masking then, and they'll need masking on both sides as well because there's an interior. So personally, I'll leave those off until the end. We put some benches in the lower part of the rear, and then we move on to the upper deck, which I haven't shown you here because it's very similar to the rest of the instructions, and we're going to build it in a moment. Looking at the plastic, and we have a lot of smaller sprues, which again is quite common for Miniart. I guess that supports that multitude of variants they like to produce, because I guess it lets them just replace a small number of parts and reduce the number of unused parts on each sprue for each variant. I started construction with the engine, which is what this instruction suggests. At this stage I wasn't really sure whether I would leave the bonnet open to show the engine or not, so I built it up in as much detail as I could. Almost straight away we go on to absolutely tiny pieces. You can just see that there on the tip of my finger. That is a spark plug style piece that has to be glued on. There is a bit of a balance here because the plastic is quite soft, and with so many small pieces you sort of end up with a lot of detail, but there's also quite a high risk of damaging some of the parts, or of having not quite flat mating between the parts, so you do have to be very careful with those. That said, the fit is generally really good, and so the two halves of the chassis here with all these cross members fitted really well indeed. I never had any worries that this wouldn't turn out square, and never had any fit issues when it came to putting the upper platforms on top of this later on. One thing I did do with this kit fairly often was accidentally remove guiding pins or attachment pins from pieces. Here's a lovely part of PE which, to be honest with you, I didn't use. Part 13 here. You can see it's a kind of cross shape there. We have to not only attach that but bend it into shape as well, so that it has this sort of hoop or loop at the end, and then that goes onto the engine with some 12 or 11mm cable. The cable isn't supplied with the kit, you will need to supply your own. I didn't add any at this stage, but I think the engine still looks fairly decent without it. And the engine fits into the chassis, despite the fact that I cut those pins off by accident. This suspension piece here is quite typical of Miniart in that they put lots of sprue gates on these very thin pieces. We'll see lots more of that throughout this kit, and you have to be extremely careful not to snap those pieces off as you remove them from the sprue. Here's another example of those tiny parts. These wing nuts here are smaller than the sprue gates they're attached to. Once the radiator is attached to the front and the engine's in place, we can start to see things taking shape. As I said, we have loads of underside detail. I suppose it is the kind of thing that you would notice if it was missing, because you can sort of see underneath the side of these vehicles, and if it was just an empty space, I think it would be noticeable. We've got a nice wood grain texture here on this driver's compartment floor. That should take some paint and a wash very well indeed. Each of the paint schemes that I showed you earlier has its own number for the side of the engine panels. Well produced in photo etch. The only time I really had a fit issue was with these side panels for the engine, where I couldn't quite get them to go perfectly vertical. They just seemed a little bit too big. It is nice to have this level of detail given that the driver's compartment is open, of course. So we've got various pedals, levers, obviously a steering wheel. Most of it implemented in plastic, but also a couple of photo etch parts. And it was at this point that the model became quite difficult to handle for the building process because there were so many delicate parts all around. These levers here, all of the underside parts and the linkages, etc. You have to be very careful and think about where you put your hands so that you don't knock something off or break something. I think at this point we've added more parts to the underside of the kit than most kits have in their total parts count. And that is with me skipping off just the occasional piece of photo etch. Much easier to build, although still quite delicate, were the two passenger compartments. I started with the upper deck. The floor is one single piece with wooden plank texture on the floor, and on the underside of that piece the wooden plank texture for the ceiling of the lower deck. We've got a few accessories that go around the upper deck, including these wooden boxes that go at the front and back. They're not quite complete yet. They also do have a photo etched bracket and even a photo etched padlock. The upper deck seats are easy enough to build. Each one consists of 3 parts and they're handed. So we have 4 on the right hand side and 5 on the left. We have a leg that goes on the aisle side of the seat, and then the seat itself just butts up against the wall of the compartment to give it support. Again, they were left separate because of course it would be very difficult to paint underneath them if they were glued into place. Plus I wasn't sure at this point whether or not the seats would be the same colour as the floor of the upper deck, and indeed what colour the floor of the upper deck would be. The lower deck builds up in a similar way with the sides being added separately, but inside we have these benches. And this is where I had to start to plan how I was going to do the sub-assemblies on this, because of course the floor probably should be wooden, the benches certainly should be wooden, and it's going to be very hard to paint the underside of those benches if they're put in place at the moment. So I decided to leave those benches separate, and of course leave the upper deck off the lower deck. The 4 eject pin marks that you can see I filled there on the side panel were literally the only eject pin marks I saw on the entire kit. Really impressive stuff, and of course it makes the modelling process so much easier. So there's our downstairs compartment. Not too much to it really. It's nice and sturdy, nice and square as well, and you can see that upper deck fits on easily. These window frames slide in easily from the inside. It can be a bit fiddly. The instructions do give us the option of having those open, but I think for my sanity's sake I decided to have them closed. Here we have those wooden plank pieces to board off the windows. There's a great wood texture on both sides, no eject pin marks, and we even get the nail marks. I think what I'm going to do here is have one side completely blocked off, and then I'm going to cut this second piece into pieces and just use a single square and block off one of the windows. That way we get to see inside, and I do plan to have some figures inside too. Again, I need to leave these off for now because they'll be painted on both sides, and they may be a different colour to the main vehicle body. The rear staircase is made in quite a smart way. The staircase itself is a couple of separate pieces, and then the side panels and the banisters are another couple of pieces, and they interlock really well. This wooden platform goes at the back of the bus, then that staircase goes on top. Normally I probably wouldn't put these on at the moment, I'd leave them to the end. However, I think these three pieces form a nice triangle which should make a nice strong bond. So I want to get the best bonding between those parts. I don't want to be gluing painted surfaces, and I don't want to be messing around scraping paint off either. So I decided to glue them together now for maximum strength. Now this piece here, D19, this grab handle on the back of the bus, is one of several that I had a lot of problems with. As you can see, it's absolutely tiny, and in the process of removing it from the sprue and trying to take off the numerous sprue gate nubs, I broke it into 3 separate pieces by accident. There's no way I'd be able to glue those back together in a decent way, so I decided to go with some wire. This is left over from a previous project, which is why it's got some primer on it already. The first thing I needed to do is straighten it out, and the best way I know to do that is to take your piece of wire, take something flat like a metal ruler, and roll that backwards and forwards over the top of the wire. It needs a bit more work, but it's a lot straighter than it was. Then I bent it into shape, roughly similar to the original piece. The two ends are a bit long, but they can be cut down. This doesn't quite have the same curve that the original piece did, but you know what, it's better than not having it there at all. Two thin pieces which did survive were these thin handrails that go on the ceiling of the lower deck. Again, you can see I've done my best to get the nubs off there, but there's still a couple of them there where the sprue gate attachments were. They simply glue onto the underside here of that upper deck. To be honest, once you're on the passenger compartments, I feel like you're more than halfway through the kit. There were only then a few small extra details to add. This wooden platform with PE straps at the back. Finishing off the staircase. The wheels consist of a number of pieces, although I was pleasantly surprised at how little cleanup was needed and how well they went together. And of course the amount of detail that those separate parts enable us to have. So that's one of the rear wheels there with that double tyre configuration. The front wheel is a more simple design, but is still quite detailed. And that is essentially it. You'll notice how delicate that lower piece is, the chassis, with all those additions. Really hard just to pick it up without knocking something off. Then the lower deck goes into place. That's not quite in place, but it'll do for now. And then we have the upper deck. The upper deck will be left separate for painting, but I did decide to glue the lower deck to the chassis. Again, because I wanted a really strong bond with no risk of putting glue on the paint and weakening it. Here is my box of sub-assemblies. So these will all be painted separately. We've got the two benches that go in the back, along with their wooden tops. We've got those wooden boards that I mentioned earlier for boarding up the windows. I've cut that second one now. We've got the 9 seats, 5 on one side, 4 on the other side. We've got a couple of these wooden boxes. Mudguards. Tools. wheels, with a bit of cleanup still needed on the tyre, cushion for the driver, funny little bottle of something that goes next to the driver, I'm not sure what that is. And my final step before priming and painting was to put the mudguards in place. Now I'd like to show you one more thing before I go, but before I do I'd like to say thank you to all of you for watching, and well done if you made it this far into the video, and special thanks to my Patreon members and YouTube supporters. Thank you very much guys, your ongoing support is massively appreciated. Now I do want to present this bus as a medical bus, an ambulance essentially, and to do that I need some figures. Unfortunately it's quite hard to find World War I figures, and it's really hard to find figures of wounded soldiers, soldiers on stretchers from that era. However, I did manage to find some STL models to download for 3D printing. This is from Alphonse Marcel, and they do a range of models, quite a lot of them in 28mm and in other scales, but there are a few that they have in 1/35 scale. They tend to have a number of sets, and then they are available for each side. So we've got soldiers surrendering, we've got British, French, German soldiers surrendering, we've got soldiers having their photograph taken, and we've got again British, French, German versions of those, and we've got medical troops as well with wounded soldiers, again for each of the factions. So this is the UK Army Medics STL files that I downloaded. Now these are explicitly 1/35 scale. When we load them into Chitubox, which is the program to prepare them for 3D printing, have a quick look at them. They look okay, but I do feel like there's maybe a slight softness about these figures in some of the details. Now clearly these 3D models are much better than I could make myself, but I think if you look at the uniform there, the pockets, some of the straps and the buttons, they're just a little bit a bit chubby maybe. They remind me a little bit of Tamiya's really old figures, which, you know, are not terrible, but maybe are not quite up to modern standards. And simple things too, like I wonder about these crutches this soldier is on. They just look a little bit overscale to me. And if you compare here to one of the US soldiers, which I bought from CG Trader a while ago, I actually did a video on this a while ago, you can just see the American on the left, the British on the right, the extra detail on the left hand side. It's not huge, and I wonder if it's a combination of detail and what's the word I'm looking for? Just slightly better modelling of things like the cloth. If you look at the arms there on the figures, the American one, it seems to fall quite naturally, the cloth, whereas on the British soldier on the right, it just seems to be a bit a bit curvy. It's just not quite the same. There's not a lot on it, but I do think the one on the left is a lot better. But unfortunately it's a World War II figure, it's not a medical figure, and it's American, not British. So beggars can't be choosers. Anyway, I will be giving those figures a 3D print to see how they come out, and I'll be painting them in a future video alongside this omnibus. So guys, I hope you enjoyed a look at that omnibus. When I was editing this video, it seemed to be quite a quick process, but it did take me a long time to build it, mainly because of the fiddly parts, lots of PE and so on. But it was a really enjoyable build. What I need to do now before I move on to painting is research what the interior colours should be. I believe in the civilian version the interior colours are wooden. Now whether or not the army, the military, would have repainted the interior in that khaki green brown colour or not, I don't know. I suspect they would have only painted the outside and the top deck, because obviously that's visible from the air. But I will research that and let you know in a future video. So thank you once again for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, have fun modelling.